So now it's time to learn how to fill the border areas of our quilt. And for this section, I decided to use a design called Basic Spiral. So to quilt this design, first spiral into a circle, then spiral your way back out again. Now, as I'm quilting this border, I'm actually going to butt up against the appliques within it and stitch in the ditch around them. And I did this for a reason. There are about 20 or 30 circular shapes in this border, and there are so many that I knew if I had gone in and stitched in the ditch around every single one of them before I started filling, it would have been very time consuming, and it would have been a whole lot of thread breaks in my quilt that I would have to then tie off and hide later. So instead of doing it that way, I decided to instead fill the design, fill the area, and stitch in the ditch at the same time. So by doing it this way, I'm minimizing thread breaks, I'm making the design a lot faster to stitch, and I am also evenly filling the area all at the same time. So this is something that works really, really well. And depending on the design that you use, this is very easy. And I'm using Basic Spiral in this situation, and this is an interlocking design. This is kind of a different design type, and it's a little bit more tricky because this is a design type based on estimation. You need to estimate the amount of space you have and then fill your circle. Estimate the amount of space you need to leave in the circle open as you spiral into it, so that way you have enough space to spiral back out again. So basically, you want to leave double the amount of space going into the spiral than you need to get out. So that way, as you're stitching back out again, you can stitch right through the middle and get all the way back out of the spiral. It's a little tricky, but it's honestly, once you stitch a good number of spirals, once you get the hang of it, it's really not that difficult. So I just took that spiraling line right up against that circle, stitched in the ditch around the circle, and then continued my spiral on and around. It takes a little bit of practice in order to get the hang of stitching the ditch and filling at the same time, but it really does help to make the design move that much faster. So now I've sped things up just a little bit here, and I want you to see this from the angle, from a farther angle, and the way I ended up quilting the entire border. And I'm quilting this basically from left to right, moving around the quilt. And of course you can see me stitching the ditch around this larger circle right here. And I'm only quilting about 1/2 of the border at a time. You can see I don't really stretch the basic spiral design beyond the middle section of the border. I'm just simply trying to connect with those appliques, stitch in the ditch, and fill the area closest to the outer sashing area. And I'm doing this for several different reasons. One reason is it is really easy to stitch a row, but when your row gets too wide, and this is a 5-inch border, if your row gets too wide, it can be very difficult to keep it under control and keep the design moving evenly. Or at least that's my experience with it. So I like to keep my row under 4 inches, and when I'm filling relatively densely, and this is about stitched on about 1/4 of an inch scale, so that's not super dense, but at the same time you're keeping your lines of stitching fairly close together. In this situation, I really like to stitch about a 2-inch row, and 2 inches runs right down the middle basically of the border. So I'm just stitching this border, and you can see I just turned a corner there, rotated my quilt around, and now I'm stitching in the ditch again. And just simply filling in the area between the circles and the sashing with Basic Spiral. The really nice thing about quilting the border areas of your quilt is that they're far easier than the blocks or even the sashing areas. It's kind of like I said in the all over quilting part of this video series, you've eaten your vegetables first. You've gotten the hardest part of the quilt finished, and that's the center part of the quilt, really, the part that you're fighting so much bulk of the quilt with. And you've finished all that up, and so now this area with the borders is far easier because there's so much less of the quilt to move around. If you do find yourself having trouble still moving the quilt around evenly, you might want to consider investing in a Supreme slider. It's a Teflon coated sheet, and I am using one actually all the time in my videos, and I have one on this table and underneath my machine, and it allows the quilt to move so much easier and smoothly on the surface of the table. It simply helps to reduce the friction between the back of the quilt and the tabletop, and this makes it a lot easier to move the quilt and still have a beautiful range of movement and these beautiful flowing designs. So now I've sped things up and moved to the opposite side of the border, so that way you can see how the second half of the border really fills. And I also changed direction, so I'm actually moving this time towards myself, whereas before I was moving more in a left to right fashion. I rotated the quilt around, so now I'm stitching really kind of from the top to the bottom, moving towards myself. And I found that this was far easier as far as keeping a good visual on where the quilt is and where I'm going, how I'm stitching. If you can't see what you're doing and where you're going, you really can't quilt very easily in free motion. You'll notice that I am right on the edges of this quilt, and I stitch sometimes off the edges, all over the batting and all over the backing fabric sometimes. And really, in typical quilts, if this was a show quilt, I would have cut this border about 3 or 4 inches bigger on all sides, so that way I wouldn't run into the edges, because you can get a lot of fabric issues with pleats and that kind of thing, just simply because the borders want to pull up on you. And that's why I cut my borders a little bit bigger, so that way I don't have to stitch right to the edge. But in this situation, I was cutting down my borders and didn't think about it, and of course I regretted that once I actually got to this section. And it's quite tricky. It's quite tricky to quilt, and you'll notice my hands, how I'm pulling and holding onto that fabric so it doesn't pull up on me as I'm stitching right across the edge there. And it's one of those things that if you start having a lot of difficulty with it, simply stop, try and find another way of holding the quilt with your hands, or securing it with your fingers, or penning it. Do something else, something different, to try and find a way so that the fabric won't continue to pull up on you. As you can see, butting these 2 rows basically of basic spirals up against each other is really not very difficult. Just simply taking the spiral shapes and interlocking them, trying to estimate their size and shape in each area. If you have to occasionally stitch a little point into an area, that's something that is definitely involved in the design. And there's certainly no rules, no right way or wrong way to stitch it. If you need to stitch a point occasionally to fill in an area, like you just saw me do right there, that really keeps the design moving more consistently and stops there from being big giant open gaps somewhere in the design, and that would be honestly far more noticeable. So it's better to fill an area even more tightly rather than leave a big open gap. So now that we've finished this border, let's check out what it looks like when we've finished it. Here's what it looks like when you've completely filled a border area with basic spiral. Don't miss the next video in this series. Check it out at freemotionquilting.blogspot.com.